expression analysis. And today I'll be taking you through the basics of facial identification. Since this is a very elaborate subject, I don't think it will be justified to actually bring everything in a single session. So yeah, depending upon the needs, we may actually plan another rounds of it. But today I'll be taking you through what actually comes under facial identification and what we actually do here. So is my screen visible?
Yeah, your screen is visible, yes.
Okay, great. So just a minute. So what is facial identification? So basically, the ultimate aim of all facial approximations for forensic purpose is to recreate an in vivo continence of an individual, normally when no other identification in evidence which bears a sufficient visual resemblance to the missing or deceased person is available. So that it may contribute to the recognition and lead to identification via discovery of new evidences. Facial approximation has gone through numerous stages and has been differently inspired. Different researchers have been applying different methods over the centuries with an ultimate goal of veritable facial identification. So the two current approaches where facial identification is used these days is for commercial purposes and for forensic purposes. So if you're talking about commercial purposes, they are usually like if you mark your attendance or probably in your IDs, if we have in our UIDs, so that is the commercial purpose of it. And if there's some kind of um, investigation involved and the identification of the person is to actually identify the individual's involvement in a particular case, then that falls under forensic category. So to begin with this process, I think there are like numerous terms which are used synonymously about facial identification. They're like facial recognition, facial reconstruction, facial approximation, and facial identification. So undoubtedly, they all seem similar, but yes, they have differences, and we should actually be aware of and should understand the basic differences between all these terms so that we don't go wrong with the usage. So as far as recognition is concerned, if we are actually trying to identify an individual out of masses, then we call it recognition. And then if we can ascertain the identity, then only it is called facial recognition. Reconstruction is a term which has been widely used for the cases where partial remains were available in terms of like a decomposed body or charred remains. Uh, you actually recovered those remains somewhere, and then you are trying to actually identify or probably reconstruct how that person used to look to actually ascertain his identity, his or her identity, and that is what we call reconstruction. But then reconstruction also means that you are creating the exact replica of how that thing was before, which is not practically possible because that requires a lot of database like facial soft tissue thickness database, ethnicity details, because everything has influence on it. There are external and internal factors that influence the facial morphology. And because we don't have that explicit database, we can't actually do 100% replica of how that person used to look. So that is why we can't call it reconstruction. And the better term would be approximation, because somehow we say that, okay, the person is relatable and it is now helpful as an assistive measure for the people who are conducting the investigation to identify the individual. So for a facial approximation is the more appropriate term to be used here. And then there's another is identification. So identification is generally when you don't know the person, when you don't know where that individual, to which area that individual belongs, and you actually need to identify that individual. We call it identification in general. So there are two terms which are more widely used, more specifically in biometric identification cases. So these terms are identification and verification. So basically, we also label them as circumstantial identification and positive identification. So in identification, what happens? Suppose there was a dead body at a scene. You have recovered that dead body and you want to actually know that who that questioned dead body belongs to, or probably what is the identity of the individual. So then you actually go and search the database of all the missing individuals in that specific area, and you have multiple list of people, and then you compare those descriptives of that dead body with all the descriptives about those individuals who are missing from that specific area. So it's 1 to n comparison. So that is what we call identification. And once we have identified, okay, this may be the probable person, and then we do 1-to-1 comparison, either with his pictures or by calling their parents, or like there can be multiple ways of comparison also, or maybe we can use the UIDs and compare the pictures using scientific methods. And when we do this 1-to-1 comparison, then that is to actually validate our observations and to actually ascertain that, okay, our assumption about that identity was right. So that is what we call verification. And because the verification actually involves point-to-point comparison, we call it as positive identification. In any kind of legal case, if you want to actually establish the identity of the individual, then verification is something that we do. So process progression. So by process progression, I have listed here 2 things. So basically, when we talk about facial identification, there are 2 ways of approaches that we may follow. The first approach, that is type of technique, is how the techniques actually developed and how they have progressed so far, and how we have actually reached the recent stage of advancement that we have in this field. And the second progression way would be by understanding the different techniques available on the grounds of the sample submitted. So here I mean, by techniques, we mean that, okay, how it all started. So what was the history of it, how those techniques developed, and how it actually raised the need to change the methods which are being used and actually to devise new methods, and how we have been progressing all through the years, and we have reached the sophisticated methods these days. And by type of sample means, no, undoubtedly, like there are multiple techniques available out there for analysis, but then all those techniques may not be applicable to a specific evidence. For example, if we are talking about CCTV images, and if there is a question individual there, anthropometry won't play a role there. And 3D reconstruction is not required there, or computer-assisted reconstruction is not required there. So we can also understand this on the basis of the type of sample submitted. So I'll be taking you through all these on the basis of the techniques that have developed so far. So we all know that whosoever is in forensic field, we all know that anthropometry is believed to be where the whole facial identification studies started. So basically, if we go back to the history, the research in the field of facial identification began in the Neolithic period, where skull plastering and pre-pottery methods were used for facial reconstruction. So later, facial masks were molded upon the superficial features of the face. And in Middle Ages, dead bodies were spread out in the avenues for identification. And because that was not very hygienic way of presentation, it actually had serious hygienic concerns because the body is used to decompose. So later on, they actually used to display only the heads, and they didn't display the whole body for identification. So that is how face as identification has been involved in as an evidentiary material. So face, why is face important as an evidentiary material, or probably to actually identify an individual? Because our memory, or probably our association of thoughts about any individual, goes back to their face, because face is involved in not only in verbal conversation, but is also involved in non-verbal communication. So because of its involvement in non-verbal communication, a face is something which is a standard marker for identity as far as individual conversations or individual identity measures are concerned. Then in 15th century, human dissection was practiced to contemplate anatomy. And in 17th century, wax modeling using the skeletal framework was developed. Artists during this period are considered as pioneers of facial recognition. And as we have mentioned here, that anthropometry actually started in 1913. Anthropologists actually started studying sex and racial characteristics in the skulls. And the studies were also conducted on estimation of age of deceased. Drawings of culprits were also being made on the basis of the description by the victims or probably the witnesses. So that is how in 19th century, so Alphonse Bertillon started this anthropometry method where 10 body measurements were taken. The whole idea behind doing this was that biologically, every individual is different. Our heredity is different. The conditions where we live are different. The features that are specific to a certain region or population are different. And that is something which makes us all individualistic in nature, our appearance individualistic in nature. And no doubt it makes us individualistic, but there are certain characteristics which are common in a certain group of population. And those actually help us set associations. And why is setting associations important? For example, there's a unknown body recovered somewhere. So if we all understand there are three types of races that we analyze, but we don't go by the concept of racial identification anymore. We actually go by ethnic origin more because that is more specific, and because of the different reasons, there are more variations now, and it is actually better to analyze the ethnic uh, factors and to keep that in consideration if you are trying to actually identify an individual. So that is why if we talk about like certain populations, studies have been done, researchers have reported that every population group have certain specific characteristics. For example, we generally believe that North Indians are taller, and then there are facial characteristics which are different in different regions of India also. So if we'll talk about racial identification, I feel that it won't be actually justified to segregate us all into like 3 or 4 major groups. It is more appropriate to actually go by the identification systems which help us differentiate from each other. So that is why we study these factors. So because these factors actually set association also and are also individualistic in nature, anthropometry is something which has been used over the years to identify individuals. Here what happens, there are like 10 body measurements. We'll go into the details of this when we study this. But yes, there are 10 body measurements like circumference of head, arm span, sitting height, left hand length, right foot length, ear length. So there are like 10 body measurements that Bertillon believed are unique to everybody. And those 10 features were actually, he did that study on all the criminals in the police and created a database and started using it for identification purposes till the time fingerprints came as a method of identification. And then anthroposcopy is something which is or which has been the base of all this study. So no doubt that anthroposcopy as a method of identification was more prominent, became more prominent in the earlier 20th century. But because earlier also people were actually describing the individual's appearance, they were actually defining the features of the person they actually saw involved in a crime. So this is something which was being used but was not recognized as an important study subject, or probably an important way of setting identification also. So anthroposcopy basically is a study of anatomical features. Like so there is no measurement involved here. It's just on the basis of description. Like I have added an image here for you to understand that anthroposcopy basically is about how to actually categorize various features so that anybody who's going to actually draw that face, either like, because sketching, it is the base for sketching, it is the base for identity kit, it is the base for photo fit method, it is the base for the 3D, 2D reconstructions, whatever methods that we use. Anthroposcopy is the base for it because the shape of eyes, the size of eyes, the space between the brows and eyes, the thickness of brows, the color of eyes, every little detail, every little description about an individual comes under anthroposcopy. So these are the few examples that I have listed here, but then it involves hair color, hair type, hairline, everything about the forehead, whether it's stoop, it's sloping, it's straight. Then it's about eyes, whether they are deep-rooted, they are prominent, they're protruded, they're close-set eyes, they're wide-set eyes, they're big eyes, small eyes, micro eyes, they are colored, or they are brown or black. So everything, every little detail about every single feature of identification comes into anthroposcopy. So your height, your skin color, and your overall stature and build also falls under anthroposcopy. So as I mentioned, that anthroposcopy is the base for all these studies. Sketching. So sketching was something which was initially used by policemen to actually draw the face of the person on the basis of the descriptions given by the victims and witnesses. So what happens? Sometimes there are certain features that you may have seen, but they're not easy for you to actually describe them. For example, yes, you know that they're deep socketed eyes, and then there may be like two features in a specific, two characteristics of a specific feature that you can't actually, that sometimes a layman is not able to describe. Under those circumstances, we actually sometimes failed to actually recognize that important part of information, and then it leads to um, missing out that information while drawing the sketch. And then sometimes this missing out of small information leads to a lot of remarkable change in the way that sketch turns out to be. And that is why every single detail is important. And when people realize, people who are working in this field realize that this is difficult to actually keep it only on the grounds of descriptions and then drawing everything, it is a tedious job. So they came up with better ways, where first one which was devised was identikit. So when we talk about sketch that the policeman draws on the basis of statements is called facial composite, and it can be drawn in two ways. So basically, there's a forensic artist who's an expert on this and who has a good hold on. A good command on the artistic skills is the person who's involved in this work, and this can be done on in two ways. Rather, it can be a freehand sketch or it can be a metric sketch. By freehand sketch, we mean that, okay, somebody is describing the features and the person is drawing it. And by metric sketch, it means that you are actually keeping in mind certain considerations, like considering that human face is never circular. It's either oval, and there are like variants of face shape. It can be inverted triangular, it can be heart shape, it can be oval, it can be oblong. So if we talk about all these facial shapes, they're basically oval. Oblong is an elongated oval. Inverted triangle is something which is lesser wide on the head and more wide on the cheek. And heart shape is head is more wider than the cheek. So like they are like more or less, they all fall in one category. They're oval, but then there are minor differences in where the dimensions vary. So we start with drawing an oval, and then we cut out like into two halves. We draw one line which separates left side from right side equally, and then one line separating the upper half from the lower half equally. We'll be talking about planes later on, in the later slides. So after dividing this whole section into two equal halves, what we do is we draw eyes. So as you can see here, there are like few lines marked here. So those lines actually determine that the nose width is equal to the width gap between the eyes, and the size of the eyes should be in a way that 5 eyes should fit in one single row. And then the chelion is basically the closing point of the lips. So chelion should fall under the endocanthion. Endocanthion is the innermost point of the eyes. So it should all be in line with this. And when you keep these certain considerations in mind, when you draw it on the guideline of some measurements, on the basis of some measurements and grid, then we call it a metric sketch. And if you do it a freehand sketch, then it's a freehand sketch. And then identity kit is something where actually an artist draws out all sorts of hairlines, hair types, eyes features on a transparency, and then keeps them. And then these transparencies are kept one above the other. They're superimposed probably to actually make out an image out of that. So the difference between identikit and photofit is that identikit method was hand-drawn images on transparencies, while photofit method was where the pictures and mugshots of different features were kept in records, and those pictures were actually laid out together to construct the face of the individual. So basically, both methods work on joining the pictures or joining the features, overlaying them in order to construct a final image. But the only difference is in identikit, they are sketches, in photofit, they are images. So the next method which was developed was superimposition. So superimposition is of three types. Superimposition is where actually you use the picture of the individual and the questioned skull or dead body, and then you superimpose their images to verify the identity of the individual. So I'm saying verify because we are doing one-to-one comparison and superimposition. So superimposition is of three types: photographic, videographic, and roentgenographic. So photographic superimposition is an imposition where we compare the skull with the picture uh, by using photographs. I'll explain this method later. And roentgenographic is where we do the individual comparison with the X-ray. So because X-ray, because of X-ray, we call it roentgenographic superimposition. So this is the basic model of how photographic superimposition works. So this is a bit complex, but it is advisable that you use it. But I have simplified it for a better understanding, considering that we have limitation of resources here. So I've drawn it out in a simpler way. So if you see on the right, there is a life-size image of the individual, and then in front of the life-size image of the individual, we keep a 11 mm grid, and then there's skull, and we keep a 10 mm grid in front of that skull. So the first question that comes to the mind is that why is this difference of size of grid between the two, and then why are we using the grid? So basically what happens if say that we are keeping the skull in the picture in the frontal profile, so if in the frontal view, so a minor tilt in the positioning may actually distort the whole examination, may lead to false negative results. So in order to actually ensure that both the skull and the image are in the same plane, we keep this grid. So if the grids align, that means the pictures, both of these subjects are in the same plane. So the next question is why there is 10 mm grid in front of the skull and 11 mm grid in front of the image. So basically, as we all know that we have a layer of skin, muscles, and fat on the skull that makes our face. So initially, to actually compensate that difference that we have, the grid in front of the image is bigger than the grid in front of the skull. So considering there might be some people who might feel that then in that case, if we have like extra dimensions on the face and lesser on the skull, the bigger grid should have been on the skull side. But what we do is that once both these grids are in same position, we enlarge the grid or in front of the skull to the size that matches the grid in front of the image. So when they overlay, we believe it to be an ideal match or probably in ideal conditions. So there's a light source in orange that you can see. The light source is used, and the light source actually throws light on the both subjects, and then the camera records the image. Then once this image is in the camera, it goes back here to the tinted glass. Because of the tinted glass, the light reflects and goes here to the half silvered glass. The image, the light coming from the skull, because it's half silvered, passes through it and reaches the monitor, while the one coming from the tinted glass side strikes the half silvered side and also gets reflects to the mirror monitor. But then there was a problem, and then you do the analysis. But there was a problem with this method. So the only outcome or uh, the only opinion that you might have about it, or probably the only time you saw whether or not these are in a proper position, and these are in an desired position for comparison. The only way to check it was when you get the final outcome as pictures in the monitor, and then you had to go and change everything and then again click pictures and then observe it. So it was a very tedious process. In order to actually facilitate that process and to actually redo the same thing again and again, they devised videographic superimposition. So rather than keeping still cameras, they kept video cameras. And there's a a synchronizer, which, and the video cameras actually used to move. So whatsoever was the desire, like, okay, if there is some angle change or some tilt is required, they used to actually change the position of the camera and simultaneously monitor it in the screen. And this was much easier process and faster also, because the whole process of going and doing things again and again and verifying it again and again was lengthy. And this actually cut short the time and was more convenient and easy to use. The method was same, but rather than using the skull, when we use the X-ray, or probably rather than using the image, when we use the X-ray, we call it row into xenographic superimposition. So next is 3D reconstruction. So 3D reconstruction is something which is pretty common. You must have seen it in various movies and TV shows. They show, okay, you have recovered a skull, and then you use the clay modeling method for identifying what that individual might look like. So this is 3D reconstruction. There are two ways of doing it now. The appropriate term for this would be approximation, as I mentioned earlier, because it is not possible to actually 100% 100% reconstruction of the face how it used to look. So that is why it's more advisable to call it facial approximation. So there are a few images here that we'll study in the next slides to understand what is happening here. So this is done in two ways. This is 3D reconstruction. The image that is here is clay modeling. So clay modeling is a lengthy process. You can't actually try on different variants here. You can only do one set of preference. You need to decide one set of preferences of features, hair color, eyes, or probably the arrangement of features, and then you can't redo it again. So there's limitation on the variation that you may try here. And then this is a lengthy process also, and this is destructive in nature, because the skull that you have, you build your structure on that skull. So they came up with computer-assisted reconstruction, which is easy to do, which is much better in terms of outcome. You can impose more characteristics, you can try different variations, and you can actually also see different type of appearances and how that person might look. So we have like multiple options and multiple results here. So it's more advisable, and then it is non-destructive in nature too. So computer-assisted facial reconstruction or approximation is a better method over 3D reconstruction. So as you have seen here in the first image, there are like few points here. So these points are basically the landmarks. So on the basis of the study that researchers have reported for a particular population, we decide that which landmarks are of importance for us to build our structure on. But for any kind of superimposition, like I mentioned, this facial soft tissue thickness, facial soft tissue thickness is of utmost importance. You can't actually reconstruct any face without understanding the facial soft tissue thickness. So basically, there are like 40 landmarks which people usually have studied for facial soft tissue thickness, but then there are ongoing study, and you actually can never mark a limit of how many landmarks you can incorporate for doing the reconstruction part. But then for computer-assisted programs, researchers have considered around 66 landmarks also, and even more. But for any kind of study that we are doing, 29 set standard landmarks are acceptable to perform any kind of reconstruction work. So I have added a MRI image here. So if we talk about facial soft tissue thickness, so facial soft tissue thickness is something that influences the outcome of the reconstruction process. So it is important that we should have population-specific database for it. So in the 19th century, criminal investigation started assuming a prominent role. And in 1980, UK police started applying clay modeling for facial reconstruction. The facial soft tissue thickness studies began in somewhere around 1883, and the first scientific reconstruction was done in 1884, where the self-portrait, death masks, and skull were compared. So some researchers have also studied facial soft tissue thickness for technical drawings. So because of its influence, it is very important to actually understand this, and there are different ways of doing that. So initially, when all these researchers realized the importance of facial soft tissue thickness. They used to conduct these studies on the dead bodies by using the needle probe method. So basically what they did is, when they had the dead body, so they used a needle, used to prick it on various identified landmarks. So by identified landmarks, you mean they're like different nodal points on the face, uh, which can be used to base your facial identification studies on. So either it is 3D reconstruction or superimposition or metric sketching or computer assisted reconstruction. These nodal points are very important. So there are certain landmarks on the face like nose tip. It moves, right? Uh, it's not something that doesn't get affected with any kind of changes. For example, if you're smiling, so the position changes. So similarly, the corners of mouth, when you're smiling, they change. When you are frowning, they change. When you're neutral, they change. So these kind of landmarks you can't use to base your identification study on. So for identification study, we need to understand those landmarks which show maximum variation in terms of, uh, in a way that may influence the outcome. For example, if we are studying the facial soft tissue thickness, the cheeks are more, cheeks have more muscle than the sides of our eyes. So we can't actually have the thickness around eyes and cannot skip measuring the cheek thickness, because if we won't do that, that will actually change the way the face will appear. So there are certain landmarks where this variation in dimension is very important. So either we select those landmarks because of the variation that they have, or because of uh, their permanency. Permanency as in, for example, if you talk about endocanthion, it remains same no matter you are smiling, no matter you are frowning, or it's a not neutral image. Even after attaining a certain age, when the aging changes start setting in, even like for a certain period of time, like till late 60s, these landmarks don't change. Like there are certain landmarks that never change. So that is why the researchers actually conducted studies and identified certain landmarks on which they have been using to design their studies. So here, so as I mentioned, a needle probe method was used. So they used to thrust that needle at a certain landmark and then mark it with the tape, take, uh, take it out, and then they used to measure it with the scale. But then there are certain factors that may influence the results here. For example, after death, the post-mortem death changes start acting, in which first changes that skin starts getting loose. So if you will thrust a needle because of this loosening of skin, uh, it may alter the measurements. And then also, like, there is a delayed stage of decomposition when there's body, the digestion of inner tissue sets in. And because if you have a decomposed body and then you conduct a study on that body, it will definitely affect the measurements. And then there are certain other factors like how you're doing it. If you're stretching the skin, it may change the measurement. If you're keeping it loose, it may change the measurement. So that is why they realized that needle probe method is not an ideal way of collecting the facial soft tissue thickness. And there have been studies on using CT scans and MRIs, and MRIs have been believed to be and reported to be a better alternative of collecting facial soft tissue thickness measurements. Because one, CT scans are two-dimensional and multiple frames or multiple planes are not possible. In MRI, there are multiple planes that you can analyze, and then this is three-dimensional. So you can take you can consider all sorts of landmarks, and it's more more uh, it is more convenient and uh, more diverse in terms of number of landmarks that you can analyze using this method. So there are different planes where we actually locate these landmarks on and then measure the facial soft tissue thickness. The first image that I've shown here is a mid-sagittal plane. So a sagittal plane is a plane which divides body into two halves, left and right. Considering this is mid-sagittal plane, so it means it divides body into two equal halves, left and right. So that means if this plane, this plane of the MRI means the body, it is exactly the center point of the face. So there are like 13 landmarks that we point here. So I'll just brief out all these landmarks. Yes, you can see them in the image, but then to understand why all these points have been considered, you will get to know when we mention their names. So the first name here is supraglabella. So if you know that glabella is a specific it's a specific characteristic to identify a male skull. So glabella is only present, like is prominent only in males and not in females. So the protrusion here between the two eyebrows is called glabella. The point just above the protrusion is called supraglabella. So the first point of consideration is supraglabella, second is glabella, third is nasion. Nasion is the depression right under the glabella where the nose starts is nasion. And then end of nasal, the root of the nose is the end of nasal. Mid philtrum is there is a septum above your lip, and the centermost point of it is mid philtrum. Upper lip margin, it's clear like uppermost point of the lip margin and centermost point of the lip margin is upper lip margin. And similarly for the lower lip, it's lower lip margin. And then, wait a minute. Oh, okay. Okay. And then there are mental eminences, chin lip fold. So there's a depression right under the lip, and that depressed point is called chin lip fold. And mental eminence is the protruded part of the chin, is mental eminence. So beneath the chin is right under your chin, where sometimes, like if you have double chin, so the point behind which the double chin is there, the point just under the chin is called beneath the chin. Vertex is the topmost point of the skull, and then opisthocrine is the posterior most point of the skull, and the bend where the neck joins the skull is enion.
Manapritji, just to sorry to interfere, there is a request from the participants to just slightly raise your mic volume.
Okay, okay, I'll do that. Is it better now?
Yeah, sounds better.
Okay, okay. So yeah, so first plane was mid-sagittal plane. We pointed out all the landmarks in the center middle portion of the face, and then the next planes that we take are parasagittal plane. So mid-sagittal is which divides the body into two equal halves, left and right. Parasagittal is which is slightly like slightly moved to the left or the right side. So there are two images here. One is for left side, one is for right side. So there is frontal eminence. So it's, as you can see, the 14 point is marked here. So on your forehead, there is a little protrusion that is called frontal eminence. Then second is supraorbital margin and infraorbital margin. So in these studies, if there is anything with the word supra, it means above, and infra means the lower one. So orbital is eye orbit. So the skull structure that eye orbit, supraorbital margin is the above the eye socket, and infraorbital margin is below the eye socket. So there are three landmarks pointed here for each side. So for the left and for the right side, parasagittal. And then there are two coronal sections. So coronal section is a section that divides body into two halves, front and back. Um, here there are 2 points. One is porion and the other is gonion. So because so before understanding this, you need to understand where porion and gonion lies. So the angle of the jaw is gonion, and the point just above the ear canal is porion. So if we are trying to understand, okay, there's one plane near the ear point, it can't actually measure the difference of the jaw. So that is why we take two planes, two coronal planes, one at the level of inner auditory canal, that is porion, and one at the level of gonion. So we measure both for right and left side. And then we take three transverse sections. So, and if you will see your own face, or if you will try to understand this by analyzing your own face, if you check the area behind your eyes, it has the least softness. That means you can actually understand that there is little, like very less facial soft tissue thickness there. If you check your cheeks, they are, it's more. And if you see the area where your jaw is, like near your molars, so it's quite, it's more than, even more than the cheek region. So considering that there is a huge variety in the transverse regions, so basically transverse section is the section that divides the body into two halves, upper and lower. So one plane would go at the level of Whitnell tubercle. So I'm not sure, have you read the bones of the skull so far? But so there is a frontal bone. The bone of the forehead is called frontal bone, and then the bone of the cheeks is called zygomatic bone. So both these bones meet behind the eyes, where our eyes, so the temples of the temple region. So where both these bones meet, so Whitnell tubercle is something that is located inside the eye socket, but somewhere around the same region. So we take one measurement from there, and outer canthus is ectocanthion, the point where our upper lid meets the lower lid. The externalmost point of the eye is called outer canthus, and we take one plane on the plane of our eyes. Second, we take at the level of cheeks, and then the third level is supra M2. So as I mentioned earlier, supra means upper, and M2 is second molar. So this is the third plane that we take, and if it was infra M2, that means lower second molar. So these are the regions where we gather information about all these facial soft tissue thickness. And then, as you can see in the first image, there are certain dots that you can see here. I'll just wait for a moment for that image to appear. Yeah, this image. So what happens, there are different markers which are available. There are different materials which are available to actually label these markers. So what we do is that we take all these facial soft tissue thickness measurements for a specific population. As far as India is concerned, there have been a study on North Indian population, and there is a database available for that. So basically, if there is any kind of person that body you have recovered in here, so you can actually use that database to identify the individual. After marking all these, so basically it's like a straw. You actually measure it for a specific landmark, cut it and mark that landmark on that specific material. And then after you have all these measurements and landmarks set, then you actually place all those landmarks on the skull. That is what we do as a basic practice before starting any kind of reconstruction. So for 3D reconstruction, what we do is we start with the regions which are most depressed, like cheeks and eye sockets. And we never actually go by taking a bulk of materials and pushing it or thrusting it on the skull, because that will actually disrupt the position of the landmarks on the skull. So what we do is we actually decide on one specific thickness of layer, which may be certain millimeters, which can be initially decided. And then all the layers will be of the same thickness, so that you, by the time you end it, by the time you and putting layers on it and achieve the ultimate height of the landmarks, you should be able to actually calculate that what was the distance, or probably what was the measurement of that specific region. So we do it layer by layer rather than doing it in one single go. So that is how we do it. And after you have placed these layers, we start constructing the features of the face. So construction of features of face is something. So basically, once we have put in this facial soft tissue thickness landmarks on the face, we can use that image then for either 2D reconstruction, 3D reconstruction, or computer assisted reconstruction. For 2D reconstruction, what we'll do is, once we have that image with us, we'll start drawing the features on that, on the basis of the landmarks only. And for 3D, it means we'll start sculpting everything in clay modeling. And as far as computer assisted is concerned, we'll start overlaying the layers and then start building the structure on that. So the process of it actually depends on which technique you're using for identification purposes. So as far as this, I think it's very difficult to actually demonstrate how you reconstruct nose, eyes, and mouth in in a diagrammatic form. So I think we can actually plan another round of it, or probably do it on Google Hangouts, so that we can have an interactive session and we can draw it while we are doing it to understand the whole process better. But this GIF actually represents how the stages of reconstruction. And if you're talking about computer assisted reconstruction, so once we have all these landmarks placed, uh, there is an elastic grid that is prepared, computerized, and then after that grid means, okay, joining all the landmarks in the form of with an elastic grid. Elastic grid is something which can actually expand or compress depending upon the size of the subject. So once that grid is prepared, you actually start layering the layers in it, which is it's not advisable to actually discuss the whole process in this way, but then layers, and then you actually insert the features in there. So there's another factor which plays a very important role in any kind of identification studies that we do related to facial verification or identification. So what happens, even if it is about facial soft tissue thickness, yes, the thickness changes, and there are changes on the face, and there are like different factors that influence those changes. There are intrinsic aging factors, there are extrinsic aging factors, and body composition also plays a very important role in how the face changes with the advancing age. So basically, intrinsic aging is caused by internal biological factors. The facial aging is mainly due to natural changes that occur as soft tissue lose their elasticity, muscle tone, and volume, as well as the facial bone shape modifications resulting from lifelong and ongoing process of cranium remodeling. Additional factors which affect these changes are individuals' biological sex, ethnicity, and idiosyncratic features, which means the features which are purely unique to individuals, such as hyperdynamic facial expressions, which means uh, if you will have observed this, like there are certain people who are like even sitting in a neutral expression, they appear to be as if they are angry. That's because of their hyperdynamic involvement of expression, and then because of the practice of that specific expression over the period of years, there are certain lines that are more prominent on the face as compared to rest of the signs of aging. So these are hyperdynamic or idiosyncratic features. And then there are extrinsic face aging factors. uh, these factors actually regulating the facial aging are due to the lifestyle changes like diet, drug use, smoking. And but the main cause of skin aging here is exposure to the solar UV rays, and this is also known as photoaging. And then body composition. So basically, the muscle fibers and the fat deposition are generally reckoned as the body composition changes with aging in adulthood. With the growing age, the muscle fiber atrophy and fat evinces. It has been found that the appendages become thinner while abdominal girth expands due to general weakening of the abdominal muscles. The way in which muscle loss affects the aging face are entirely empathized in the present scenario whenever you study it. So basically, what happens that you actually can't identify all these factors specifically because there is limitation of study material which is available on this. But then uh, it may be speculated that the facial fat buys and fills out the facial folds and creases, which actually when reduces with advancing age leads to actually loosening of skin and creation of folds on the skin. Also, in addition to this, gravitational force acts on the face also, and because the construction of the baseline muscle and their arrangement of the face is completely different. Like in our orbits, they are circularly placed. The jaw muscles are the strongest and the most longest muscles of the face. Uh, because they're linear, and then again around your mouth, the face, the arrangement of muscles is in circular format. So that is why any kind of change uh, which happens because of the induction of, because of the gravitational force and because of the loosening of muscles, there'll be like different kind of uh, it will have different kind of appearance on the skin. The eyes will have eye bags. The eye bags appear because the muscles are in circular form, and then when they get loose, they have this tendency of going down because of the gravitational force, and that is why they appear in the form of uh, bags. And then jowls is something which appears around the chin because our cheeks are wide and they are puffed in our youth, and then because when this malar fat pad uh, reduces and the skin gets loosened, it has this tendency of moving down, and then skin becomes loose near the chin, and then jowls appear. So here, this lady, you can see the jowls here in this image, and this is the and that is how there are like multiple factors which influence the appearance of the face. And as far as the studies are reported, females are supposed to show delayed signs of aging as compared to men. Like by delayed signs of aging, we mean that if you'll analyze a group of 30 to 40 years old and 40 to 50 years old, and a comparative analysis of post 50 group, you'll see a sudden uh, change in facial aging after like 50 years of age in women because of the setting in of menopause. And in case of males, this aging is more gradual. So these are the certain like gender specific changes that happen. And also because women are more involved in practicing like facial or skin health routine, so that is why there are also like certain factors which are different in females as compared to males. So these are the factors which actually influence how the face appears in a specific age group, and they should also be considered when you are actually reconstructing a face. So these were the basic things which are a part of facial identification study. And then along with this, there is a completely different field which is called biometrics. So biometrics is something where we have been using the face as ID. And like there's a whole different process of first locating the face, then acquiring the image, and then comparison of the image. But then all these subjects are too wide to understand in one single go, and then depending upon the need, we may actually schedule next things. And in case you have any kind of questions still now, please feel free to ask. Okay, so I can see one question here. So if we get only half part of the skull, then do we use same procedure for reconstruction? So yeah, so most of the times we do receive partial skull also, and we do receive partially charred remains also. So what happens that our there's one very important thing here to understand, that our faces are not like our left side of the face is not an exact replica of our right side of the face, but because they are somehow similar, there are more or less differences which can be neglected in case we don't have any kind of base to work on. Under those circumstances, we actually analyze the anthropometric uh, measurements of the part which is available or the skull which is available, and the grounds of those measurements we actually build our uh, our reconstruction. So what happens, suppose you don't have the eye socket complete, and probably you don't have the half maxilla, right? In that case, what we'll do is that we'll first take the measurements, anthropometric measurements. We haven't touched that subject. So basically, anthropometric measurement is taking all the craniometric and somatometric measurements. There's a new term which is being used these days, which is called photogrammetric measurements. So craniometric measurements are the measurements of skull. Somatometric are the measurements of the face, and photogrammetric is when you are using photographs for the purpose of identification. So what happens? Craniometric measurements were used to actually base your studies on. Okay, like if you want to understand what is the facial width. So for facial width, the landmark which is important is zygion. So zygion is a point which is the extreme ends of the cheek. So because this is very subjective, to me, it may be like a point or inch above or below what you think is the extreme most point of the cheek. So the ideal way of identifying is drawing a straight line on both the sides of the face where it touches the extreme part of it, and then taking the measurements, and where it is showing the maximum measurement, that point we'll take as zygon. So if we have the zygon measurement for one side, we'll take that for the other side also. But then there are some underlying features also which help us identify if the person was suffering from some kind of disease that may affect the facial appearance. So all this study, all this analysis that we have talked about is based on people who haven't faced any kind of facial injury and who have a standard body mass index. By standard body mass index means the people who are not underweight or who are not overweight. So after taking that measurement, so what happens sometimes also, because of the change of the scale, because of the change of placement of landmarks, these measurements may vary. So to actually avoid this error or to counter this error, rather than taking the measurements, we take the indices. That is something we'll discuss later, but then these indices are more reliable in terms of if you want to actually cross-verify the reports of one individual. So after taking all these measurements, we approximate the other side of the face and base our studies on. Yes. The next question is, does teeth play an important role in facial reconstruction? If yes, then how it is be used an individualistic characteristic? So basically, I didn't get your second part of the question. It will be better if you can explain this. But yes, first, for the first part, see what happens. Teeth definitely play an important role in facial reconstruction because so here I would like to explain one thing. That in case there are no teeth in the jaws that you have recovered for the skull, yes, you can estimate their size from the base on the grounds of the sockets that are there, but then it will be more of an approximation, and it will actually add more range to what we are trying to build on that skull. So what happens? Basically, our teeth, you'll see that sometimes on the basis of how this maxilla and mandible are in line with each other, there are some which overlay, there are some where the maxilla is protruding, there are some where the mandible is protruding. So on the basis of that, the whole appearance of the lower half of the face will change. So definitely the size of teeth also play a very important role in how this cheek's shape appears while reconstruction. So yes, it has an influence. And if you're talking about the individualistic nature of teeth in general, so there actually it is completely different. Their role as an evidence is completely different. Teeth can be used for we can extract DNA from teeth. We can actually understand the shape of mandible, like it's U form in case of males and V form in case of females. And then after identifying that, we can actually understand the basic individualistic factors that differentiate teeth one individual from the other individual, their dental anomalies. But then can you be more specific about what you're asking here about individual characteristics of teeth here? Okay, I haven't come across any study that helps us identify whether or not that person was blind, but considering that muscles do have marks on the skull, like the muscles which are more strong, where more physical labor is involved, they have strong markings on the skull. For example, the people who are these coolies on the railway station, right? They carry this heavy baggages on their head, and that is why their neck muscles are very strong as compared to rest of the people, and that is why the markings on the skull are more prominent. But I'm sorry, I'm not in a position to actually answer this question about the blind person, but definitely I'll read about it, and in case I get something on this, I'll be sharing it.
Hello.
Yes.
Ma'am, thank you for the lecture. My question is that in India, from where we can read or learn about all these procedure in deep, and how a person who is expertise in these procedure can get into circulation or a job.
Okay, so the thing is, first is from in India, where can you learn all these procedures? So the thing is, we have senior faculty members who have done work in this field. Like there are facial identification studies being done in Gujarat University. There are facial identification studies being done in Punjab University. There is a facial identification section in Chandigarh Central Forensic Science Laboratory in Chandigarh. We had Dr. Sanjeev, who is an expert on this and who have been handling like major cases in India on facial reconstruction. And yes, not only in forensic sciences, but there are some students of anthropology and anatomy departments at various medical colleges who are doing their studies on facial identification. And yes, there are some students who are also working in collaborations with IIT and designing and probably assisting them in designing better automated methods of facial identification. So as far as getting a job is concerned, first thing is the facial forensic science degree itself is not sufficient enough for you to be a facial identification expert. But there are some allied courses also which are available, which are more artistic in nature, which are related to drawing only. But as far as this reconstruction is concerned, if you have done some additional study or research on this, there are different research options that you may try, and there are different agencies that conduct research on facial identification that you may use.
Which are those agencies and which are those like?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, like there are prominent universities where there are researchers conducting research on this. I mentioned a few like Gujarat University. I think I'm not sure about Raksha Shakti, but yes, Gujarat University has, and Punjab University has. PGIMER, Chandigarh has, Anthropology Department, Punjab University has, IIT Mandi. So basically, these are the departments where I know people are working and doing their research on facial identification. And then, yeah, yes, I know a certain firms where they do that. But then for those studies, because understanding that, okay, if we are doing the computer assisted reconstruction, you need a base in computer sciences. So those that zone, specific computer assisted, is majorly available for the people who have expertise in computers. But then yes, they definitely need an assistant or probably somebody to actually associate them and guide them on how it functions on anatomically, or probably how the body changes affect the appearance. But then you need to actually do your research and have this expertise to be in that position to start your career. You can't do it on the grounds of simple MSc.
I am from Gujarat Forensic Science University and I am a forensic odontology student.
Okay.
Okay, ma'am. Definitely, I'll speak to you after this. Which are those firms and all?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I have shared my email ID here, and do feel free to reach out to me anyways, anytime. And then next is, can you recommend some books on identification and facial? Yes, there is not a single book where you can actually read about all these subjects, considering that they're all very different from each other. There are different books for different topics. So if you have anything specific in mind, do reach out to me and I might recommend you certain books. Best way of comparing passport photograph to rule out chances of impersonation. Oh, great. For example, can I get photo furnished? Okay, so the case that you're talking about here is of morphing. So because we haven't discussed the computer assisted facial identification here, so that is why we have this question is there. So there are like different as I mentioned earlier, photogrammetric approaches and elastic grid methods that are basically used for identifying the passport pictures. So what happens if you move abroad and then all these they click your picture, right? And your picture is also available on your passport. It's also available on your UID, and it's also available on your visa. So in case like you're moving and there's somebody who has his morphed image on the passport, and then is going out there and is out there for identification. So what we do is that, as I mentioned earlier, every system has their own specific landmarks that they choose to base their study on. So yes, as I mentioned earlier, some use 66, some use 40, some use 29. So I mentioned all these 29, but then there can be a biometric system that may be using like half of these, and then a set of altogether different landmarks for basing their identities on. It all depends on which biometric system they're using and which landmarks they're using, and then which method they're using. There are some who use the grid method. In grid method, there is a simple grid where you actually place your face and they actually measure the distance of one landmark from one landmark to other landmark. There's a simple metric method. And then there is Laster grid method where they actually identify certain nodal points and then connect them using the lines. And then they are able to actually even identify person from the CCTV images where you have like varied expressions, and then compare it with your image on the UID, which is with neutral expressions. So there are a wide variety of analysis methods which are there to actually identify. Okay, so if you're talking about identify a criminal who has gone through a plastic surgery, this is more which is prominent in movies and very rarely encountered in oh great. Oh, if Phanendra wants to actually answer this question.
The impersonation?
No, that plastic surgery. You said I saw a message where you said you want to answer this question.
No. I was just segregating the questions, so
Okay,
the question can be answered by you only.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as far as this plastic surgery is concerned, so basically there are like different types of plastic surgeries depending upon the intervention, the level of intervention. So Botox is also one of the methods to enhance your appearance or to actually counter the aging changes on the face. So Botox is there, and then feature correction or feature enhancement is something which is prominently being used. So what happens, there are certain node points, like we never base our studies on 10 points. Like suppose there are 29 landmarks that one system is using for analysis, and then somebody goes and actually enhances their eyes, or probably gets rid of eye bags, or probably change it, but you can't actually change it completely. There is a definite scope of improvement, but then there are limitations to everything. If your underlying structure is not if my jaw is squarish, right, you can't actually take and change it completely and make it oval. No, there is a limitation in scope of what kind of changes that you may induce. So considering those changes, there is a scope of change also. And then also there is another thing, that there are not only one feature specific landmarks that are there. There are landmarks about cheeks, there are landmarks about outer circumference of the face, there are landmarks about nose, lips, and probably their movement and association or their respective measurements also, and their relative measurements also. So yeah, sometimes it's able to identify, but we don't have substantial studies to actually claim that whether or not it is practically possible. Question on books on identification of research. Yeah, okay. So considering on what the topic of interest is, like if you want to study about facial soft tissue thickness, I recommend something else. If you talk about effects of aging on face, there is a different book. Like for every single topic, there are different books, because for some there are no books available, but then yes, there are physical anthropology manuals available. So yeah, so please reach out to me with the subject of concern, and then I will send you out the links. Can we know the exact amount of muscle deposited? I don't know, what do you mean by exact amount of muscle deposited?
Indeed, if in case you have a follow-up question, dear participants, you can raise your hands. We can allow you to speak. And that was an anonymous attendee, so I don't think we have a person to take the audio question.
Okay.
Yeah. Dear participants, do you have any further questions? You can raise your hands. Okay. So I see no questions hereby. So with this, Madam Ji, I thank you very much for your contribution and your time involved in sharing your expertise so far regarding the facial identification. As you mentioned, this is a very large subject, and 1.5 hours to spend time probably people are now aware of the dimension of the time what they should be investing in this particular study. So with this, I thank you very much for your session with us. So dear participants, followed by this session, this evening session has been cancelled because the resource person had to be engaged in some official engagement. So Dr. Harsh Sharma's session is rescheduled for Saturday, same timings, 4:30 to 6 o'clock. However, tomorrow morning we have the session from Sri Ritesh Shukla ji from Raksha Shakti University, Ahmedabad University, Gujarat. He's going to be delivering the topic on forensic microscopy. So I have shared the link on the chat window. If you have not yet registered, you can just register for the session tomorrow morning. And tomorrow the entire day, we only have one session between 10 o'clock to 11:30. All the other sessions are cancelled because we had a feedback from the students saying that their data pack is not sufficient to attend 4 sessions throughout the day. So we have considered that request. We have rescheduled the activities. You will be informed accordingly. So till tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Have a good day. Take care.
Okay, thank you, Fernanda. And in case, yeah, because as I mentioned earlier, because the subject is too elaborate and it's too different, in case like next sessions are required, I think we should prefer having Google Hangouts, because anyways 30 is something that Google can manage, and then it's easier to actually do video conferencing and do, you know, on time hands-on activity on that, and probably do it by the time we teach it.
Sure,
So,
sure.
yeah,
We'll
we can
definitely do the activity accordingly.
yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.